Hello and welcome to Games Past the Prime. This is a show where I take a look at video games and determine if they are past their prime or not. For me to do so though, there are a couple key categories which I look at. Story, presentation, and gameplay. Then at the very end, there's a conclusion section where I wrap everything up in a nice little bow. You guys have read the title. You know what game we're playing. Let's take a look at Glover. The story for Glover is pretty simplistic when you look at it. In a place called the Crystal Kingdom, a wizard rules from his castle known as the Crystal Castle. Now, the life around the kingdom is powered by the 7 crystals that rest on top of the spires of the Crystal Castle. The wizard may seem to live alone, but in fact he has a pair of sentient gloves that aid him in creating potions and spells. One day, the wizard ends up mixing a potion wrong. Sounds like the gloves' fault. And it causes a large explosion that sends the gloves flying and turns the wizard into a statue. Glover gets sent out a window while the other glove ends up falling into a bad potion and turning into the evil Cross-Stitch. The explosion also knocks the crystals off of the spire, which causes the Crystal Kingdom to become distorted, and the crystals end up falling into different realms of the kingdom. Glover realizes for him to save the kingdom and the wizard, he must collect all of the 7 crystals. As he travels through the different realms, he will be met by monsters created by Cross-Stitch. As Glover retrieves the crystals and returns them to the fountain, you'll start to notice the kingdom becoming restored to its more peaceful nature. Glover ends up having a final encounter with Cross-Stitch in the outer space realm to recover the last crystal. At this point, the wizard is restored and uses his magic to purify Cross-Stitch, thus restoring the last piece of the realm that was distorted. Yeah, that's pretty much it. A super simplistic story, but honestly, you don't need much more than that for a game like this. All you really ever need for most of these games is a simple call to action, something that makes the game important to play, and this story at least achieves in that. Now, the graphics of Glover are not bad. They look pretty good overall and have a good amount of detail. While looking at it, you will notice this game has this cartoonish vibe to it. I know I tend to say this a lot about other games, however, while Banjo has like a Saturday morning cartoon vibe, this feels more child cartoon in my opinion. I hope that makes sense because honestly, it's the only way that I could really think about describing it. The environments are a bit interesting in that it almost has like a cardboard look to it. Maybe that's just me, but for sure certain areas do seem to have this look. Now, one major downside to me is that all the realms seem pretty generic. You got the ice stage, a carnival stage, the prehistoric stage, an outer space stage, etc. However, even though they are a bit generic, they at least are neat to look at and not really that bland in my opinion. The one thing that is a bit bland though is the enemies that you will see. Each stage will have its own unique monsters, but you will quite often see certain monsters that do cross over from one stage to the next. All they really do to change these monsters is just to recolor them, which is a bit lame in my opinion, but it is what it is. Now, each stage of course ends in a boss battle, and I will be going into more detail about them later, but I do want to mention that the boss's looks are pretty unique in my opinion, and it's cool to look at. Now, let's actually move on to the music. And this is one of the better points in the game for me. Each stage is split into different parts, and they all have their own music tied to them. I really enjoy the music here for all of the parts and all of the stages. There are a couple that feel a bit generic here and there, but overall they are just simply good. The music has a really good job at matching up its tone and sound with that of the stage, and typically has this fantastic bounce to it that it just makes it really enjoyable to listen to. I don't really have anything to complain about when it comes to the music, so I'll just pick out my favorite 3 tracks to listen to and let you listen to them as well. Now, a good way to define Glover is that of a puzzle platformer. The whole goal of the game is to retrieve the crystals that have turned into bouncy balls from each realm. Each realm has 3 levels and a boss. You retrieve the ball in the first level and you must take the ball through all 3 levels and the boss fight. You have a certain amount of lives which you can replenish by getting 50 Garrops, the main collectible in the game, or by finding an extra life in the stage. There are many ways you can lose a life, by falling off the stage, or Glover losing his 3 hearts, or by the ball getting popped by an enemy. As you move through each level, you will find plenty of pits, enemies, and spikes you will need to either platform around, or in the case of the enemies, defeat to progress. Along the way, you'll find buttons that will help you progress through the levels. One of them you must use the ball to press, and the other you just use Glover to slam down the button. Now let's talk about the movement and the controls, because these are critical for talking about platformer games. The control stick is what lets you move Glover. If you approach the ball, Glover will grab it, and you will continue to move Glover and the ball with the control stick. If you press the A button while Glover is not holding onto the ball, he will jump, and then if you press the A button again while he's still in the air, he will do a double jump. Also, as a side note, you can jump onto the ball, which will change the controls for movement. Everything will turn backwards. Now, if you are holding on the ball and tap the A button, he will lob the ball up in the sky at a slight angle, and if you hold down the B button, you will get an arc to see where the ball will be thrown instead. If you are pushing forward on the control stick and hold down A at the same time, Glover will instead slap the ball versus tossing the ball. This allows you to get over bigger gaps, but the downside is that it could go further than you want it to, or the ball will bounce funny, so you need to be aware when to use it properly. If you are on top of the ball and hold down the A button, Glover will use the ball as sort of a trampoline to jump even higher than normal. If you aren't holding onto the ball and hold down the B button, Glover will point in the direction of where the ball is at, and if you are close to the ball, you can press the B button and then Glover will actually grab the ball. The Z button, while not holding onto the ball, can do many things. For example, if you just tap the button, Glover will do a cartwheel. If you hold down the Z button, Glover will go down on the ground and crawl. And if you are in the air jumping and press the Z button, Glover will do a fist slam. Pressing the R button when you aren't holding the ball allows you to cast a spell if you have picked up a potion to do so. If you are holding onto the ball and press the R button, it will allow you to transform the ball into other objects, such as a bowling ball, which can help you to break through walls or objects and even stun enemies you can't normally defeat. A ball bearing, which is a bit heavy and doesn't have a lot of bounce, and I typically used this when I wanted to cross gaps with the ball but didn't want it to bounce afterwards, and is also useful for underwater areas, and it's also the smallest ball, which is pretty useful in its own way. Then finally we have the crystal ball, which is basically hard mode. This ball is fragile and breaks easy, but it does give you double the points when grabbing the Garrops, which I will talk more about later. So while you are holding the ball, you can transform the ball with the R button, but you can do the same by holding the B button and then pressing the R button. The C buttons allow you to move the camera some, which is nice. You never get full true control of the camera, but this C button movement kind of works just fine in my opinion. If you are holding onto the ball and tap the B button, Glover will start to bounce the ball. And if you are in the air and hold down the B button, Glover will hover in the air and go into the stance to throw the ball. This is handy because it will allow you to get to even higher areas than you could before. You can also use the slap ball instead of the throw here as well, but you have to be quicker about it. If you press the Z button while holding the ball, Glover will let it go. Or if you are in the throw animation, you can press Z to cancel out of that animation. Alright, now that we have talked about the controls and mechanics a bit, let's talk further about the game and the things I like and didn't like. First off, it took me a while to get used to these controls. For something that seems so simple, I quite often find myself screwing up the throw and slap, and it became very frustrating. Even by the end of the game, I would still make these mistakes, but it did come less often than when I was first playing. Now, moving around Glover feels great. However, moving Glover and the ball at the same time feels a little less great. Now, I know this is done on purpose. As you move the ball, it gains momentum, and thus you can't just stop on a dime. I get that, but there was plenty of times that this did get in the way of doing certain puzzles or doing certain platforming. It feels like it's a bit of an inflated difficulty in my opinion. However, because it's done like this on purpose, I'm not going to get real mad at it. It's very clear about this intent from the very start of the game. It's just something that bothered me and kept me from truly enjoying the game as much as other platformers normally would. Speaking of, I don't like how in this one, there are enemies that you just straight up can't defeat. I don't really understand the design decision for this, but there were plenty of times that an enemy was placed in the way just to piss you off because you can't defeat it, so you just need to go around it, but then it will just knock you off the ball or off the map. It was just really frustrating. Oh, and this game, at least for me, got pretty brutal towards the last half of the game. It may look like sunshine and rainbows, but this game is actually pretty hard. I was having a tough time, and honestly I ended up caving and just turning on the infinite lives cheat because I honestly just couldn't be bothered anymore. Here's where this got interesting. I ended up finding that collecting the Garibs besides getting the lives and gaining higher points was utterly useless. Collecting them all rewards you with nothing other than some bonus stages and getting that 100% completion. For a platformer, that's weird to me. I'm so used to getting something for collecting everything, so I'm not exactly happy in this case because I had the infinite lives on that it didn't matter, or sad that a platformer doesn't really have much of a reward for, well, collecting everything. Because of this, the game can be rather short, especially in my case since I did turn on the infinite lives code, of course. I imagine by not doing this, that the idea is to grind out the game, so this is another case in my mind where the game becomes hard just to inflate its runtime. I know this was common practice back in the day, but this also doesn't mean it's good game design, and it's not something I'm just going to ignore just because it's old. There are plenty of other games that don't do this, such as Zelda, Banjo, and Mario. So it's not a good excuse to say that because it's old, it's okay for these practices. Regardless, I don't think it got really hard like other games, but it does for sure inflate its difficulty pretty badly in the last two realms. I never really got that mad at the game, to be honest. I actually rather enjoyed the first half of the game and ended up kind of being bored in the last half. Sure, there was some changes here and there, but it mostly felt like the same gameplay, but just in a different setting. When I don't get mad or love a game, it makes it much harder for me to think about something to talk about, so let's just kind of move on to the verdict at this point. The verdict of Glover is a game not past its prime. So this may actually surprise people here. I don't think it really does anything really badly to warrant me labeling it past its prime. Sure, it gets hard and inflates its runtime a bit, but I don't think it's really drastic like Star Fox or Rogue Squadron. I likely could have beaten the game by just adding maybe an extra hour to my total time, which is only at 6 hours to begin with, so if I would have put in 7 or 8 hours and just taken my time through the game, I likely could have beaten the game without the cheat code. However, I likely would have become more frustrated with the game, and I didn't want to take that extra time just to do that. I didn't lose anything by cheating in this case, my score didn't change, the story didn't change, there were no reasons for me to go on without it. At this point, I had seen mostly everything in the game had to offer, so I didn't see a reason to bang my head against the wall for pride. Regardless, the game isn't bad. However, it isn't exactly great either. It's just another average puzzle platformer game that happens to have good visuals and great music. Without those two, this game would have likely been past its prime, and I only recommend checking this game out if it seems interesting to you. Otherwise, I do recommend everyone at least check out the soundtrack because that's fantastic. Anyways, let's move on to the top 5 reasons I labeled this not past its prime. Number 1. The overall presentation is just great and easily carries this game over the threshold of being a subpar game to an average game. The visuals look neat and are very colorful, while the music is just absolutely fantastic. Number 2. The gameplay loop feels alright. While I'm not a fan of the momentum-based movement, I'm sure there are plenty of people who do like it. Just because it's not a game for me doesn't mean I can't recognize that it was actually made well and done on purpose for this. Number 3. The levels, while a bit generic, are at least laid out in a good fashion. Rarely did I feel like I was lost within the game, and even more so, I found a couple of shortcuts that allowed me to beat levels really quickly, which I thought was kinda cool in my mind anyways. Number 4. The bosses are interesting in the game and have cool designs, but they for sure can frustrate you at times. However, I don't think they truly frustrated me enough to do a rant about them like I had originally thought I was going to above when I mentioned I would talk about the bosses later. I in fact did not bring them up in my gameplay section because frankly they're just kinda there. They look cool and they look neat, but to fight them is pretty simplistic and they weren't really that difficult for me to really go on a full rant about it. Number 5. The game has a decent fun factor when you first start to play it. While this does wear off, at least for me, this doesn't mean it's not fun. You also have to understand that I am beating these games rather quickly, typically within a couple days' time. While most kids or people might take their time to play through these games, thus they might not get the same amount of wear down that I happen to get when I'm playing these kind of games. Alright guys, that's the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did enjoy watching it, please consider subscribing. I upload videos every Sunday. Stay tuned to the very end of the video to get an audio hint at what my next video will be. I hope you guys all have a fantastic day, and thanks for watching.